Welcome to our April edition of the TEL Researchers series at Lancaster with Dr. Brett Bligh. He'll be introducing himself shortly, but let me just introduce your host today. So my name is Francie Duluth. We also have here with us John Brindle and Puyin Wong. Without further ado, I will introduce Dr. Brett Bligh, and he can take over from here.
Hi, I'm Brett Bligh. I am a member of staff in the Department of Educational Research at Lancaster University. I'm co-director of the Centre for Technology Enhanced Learning at Lancaster University. I co-edit an open access journal called Studies in Technology Enhanced Learning. And I've been involved in the Technology Enhanced Learning research area for, I think, almost exactly 20 years. So that's kind of my starting point. And yet, having said all of that, I want to say I'm slightly hesitant about this presentation. I give a fair amount of presentations in my life. And in fact, I would say something like 3/4 of you might have seen me at a presentation before, looking down the list of names. But it isn't very often we get asked to give presentations like this. And I think it's a very worthwhile thing, but equally, it's not something I'm particularly certain about. It carries quite a lot of risk. I was putting together and trying to think what I was going to say and constantly butting up against, well, is that really relevant? Well, it's to do with me. It's important to who I am, etc. So this is an uncertain, hesitant kind of presentation. And I think that's an important thing to acknowledge, that we often think of research as something that sort of just happens and that everybody else is getting on with it very, very nicely. And only we secretly are struggling with not enough time to do it, tiredness, imposter syndrome, and all of the other things that I imagine all of you struggle with. I certainly struggle with, and everybody who I talk to at the bar in conferences and everything else like that also struggles with. So I'm going to try and give what is a relatively unguarded presentation in which I think will have a certain shape. So the first thing to notice is that there's an actual shape I want you to really pay attention to, which is the kind of the text or the main matter of the presentation. I'm going to talk something about my history as a person. I'm going to go through how I've refined my research focus over time, because we're always being asked, or at least where I've worked, we're always being asked to kind of think about our research agendas and what is it that's our overall research mission and what are we going to be the go-to person in regards to and things like that. And the reality is that's not a very easy thing. And I want to kind of open that up for discussion. And I think some of you won't know some of those first two things. And conversely, numbers 3 and 4 might be things that are slightly more familiar. So I'm going to talk about some of my theoretical influences, but I'm going to dig a bit deeper than I often do. And then I'm going to talk about my kind of preferred methodology. And there I probably will be on the territory that's most familiar to quite a few of you, at least if you've come across my stuff before. I'm not going to give a potted history of everything. And in fact, with regard to some of these issues, I've given more lengthy talks before that are specifically devoted to them. And I'll probably mention those at various points. But the key point is, you'll notice quite a few points of inconsistency between them. And I think that is, it was the kind of thing I was worried about whether I should iron out or remove. And I thought, I'm not going to do that. Our lives as researchers are contradictory and we're pulled in all sorts of opposite directions at the same time. And the other thing is, I think in each case, they'll start in quite a different place, particularly numbers 1 and 2 and then 3 will be seeming to come from quite a different direction. And I'm hoping they kind of cohere in the latter stages of each bit. And I think that's because over time, I have gradually become comfortable with being myself through research. Whereas when I was younger and more foolish, or whatever kind of phrase you want to use, I think I kept my life quite compartmentalized, and I tried to divide myself up. This kind of is my personal hobby, and this is my personal life, and this is my professional life, and so on. And I'm not doing that so much anymore, but you'll notice a kind of gradual coherence, and they don't start very coherent at all. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to say that at the end of each of these sections, so I think we've got an hour and a half, otherwise somebody tell me I'm wrong now. I think we've got that. What I'm going to do is hopefully talk for a period of time, and then at each point, this will be a good point to check whether my pen is working. At each point, say when I get to here, I will ask for questions, and then I'll talk about this, and then ask for questions, talk about this, ask for questions. So there'll be 4 periods where you can ask questions during the talk, and at that point, the chairs will decide who's going to ask the next question and so forth. So the first one, I actually don't have any slides, and is probably, ironically, given where it's where I'm going to start, is the one I don't think I've ever talked about so much publicly. I don't think I've talked about it publicly before, certainly on a kind of internet webinar. And it's something to do with just my own personal history. But I realize how much it influences me and how much it makes me dig my heels in at certain points when I even get into quite difficult conversations sometimes. There are certain things I won't compromise on. And I realize a lot of it comes from kind of where I come from. Now, I don't have slides for this. I just have a few kind of points I want to hit. So something I'll skip over briefly, but is worth knowing, is that I grew up in a fairly backwater village in the UK, where one would get the impression that maybe 2 generations ago, there might be some actually good jobs there in mining and manufacturing industry and things like that. But the area where I grew up has none of that anymore, through a process of deindustrialization and offshoring and the after effects of what in the UK we might call the blessing of Margaret Thatcher or something like that. And where I grew up was a place where people actually didn't have a lot of personal ambition. It was a place where your ambitions were largely devoted towards the local community, or you left. They were one or the other. And also I noticed only after I left, not while I was there, how incredibly culturally homogenous it was. It was, before I went to university, I think I literally knew one person who was not white. And that person's family owned a shop. It was just one of those places, and it was the kind of thing you only notice when you leave and then look back and go, oh, And going to university, therefore, was an eye-opening experience for me. I think one mistake I had was quite substantial, which was I didn't understand for a very long time what university was. I think I was certainly the first person from my family to go to university as a conventional 18-year-old student. And I apologize for the animals in the background making noise, by the way, if you can hear those. Those are very cute, but not silent on command. So when I went to university, I didn't really understand what was supposed to happen there. And I think I viewed it as another version of school. I think I thought of it as you went to one school when you were very young, and then you went to another school to learn even harder stuff when you were a bit older, and so on, and eventually got to university where they were going to teach you the very most hard stuff, something like that. And that persisted for probably more than a year into my undergraduate studies. So I went to university as an extremely naive undergraduate student with no kind of cultural capital in this kind of game at all. And it shocked me after a while that the things that changed me most when I was an undergraduate were literally meeting people from other areas of the world. And even, I mean, I want to make this as absurd as it absolutely is, you know, to have friends who came from London, for example. But I met friends from all over the world, and I had literally never done that before. And I socialized with people and I opened my eyes and whatever. And I have to say, many people where I grew up were very, very right-wing politically. There was a movement around this thing when I was young called the British National Party, and I knew many people who were getting involved in things like that. So, and I was incredibly relieved that I just had escaped that somehow, because I could have easily ended up there. And then looking back, having had this university experience, I went through a period, I think, where I became slightly ashamed of my origins. So there was this kind of break. Now, I had some great modules when I was at university. I had some not so great ones as well, of course, and some great lecturers and some not so great ones and so on. But I realized that the most fundamental thing that changed me about going to university was literally the people I interacted with, the socializing I did, the societies I joined, the housemates I got thrown together with, all of the kind of things that, in fact, in our increasingly performative, audited, blended learning landscape seem to be exactly the kinds of things that we're constantly trying to bash out of the university system. We're constantly trying to make students work harder into every last hour of their lives, monitor what they're doing, whatever. And honestly, I do not approve. Okay, so for me, it was the fact that honestly, I think my undergraduate degree was a bit on the light side in terms of lectures and things that allowed me the time to go and do these other things that turned out to be much more important to me. The other thing that's worth saying is that my undergraduate degree was in computer science. And so I think I'd gone, again, they were going to teach me the harder stuff, right? What was that harder stuff? Well, I was going to be a supercomputer programmer, you see. That was my only vision of a better life when I was younger. So I signed up for a course on that basis. And I think what you'll figure out if you talk to people who are in the TEL field, with a few exceptions, I think Kilme is one of these exceptions, who actually did an undergraduate degree in technology enhanced learning or something like that. But that's incredibly rare, okay? Most people in the technology enhanced learning field came here through what they consider to be an unconventional route. And I'm going to describe such a route, except for the fact that it's difficult in most cases to know what the conventional route would be. Okay, so we're all kind of refugees from other kind of earlier lives. And in my case, it was computer science. And I realized what university was when it seemed I was going to finish in less than a year. You know, I had this revelation, and I suddenly had all these friends from everywhere, and I was having the life I kind of never thought I could have. And it seemed like, just as I realized how valuable and brilliant this was, it was going to end. So I thought, what am I going to do? I know what I'll do. I'll do a PhD. So that was my way of getting into it. And then what I did was I looked around, and one of the good lecturers I had on my course had funding for PhD projects. And I knew, this is now serendipity moments, I knew that his research was about how computers can automatically recognize human handwriting. So I went to him to discuss my research and how I might do something to do with the recognition of human handwriting. And he said, I need to stop you there. That's not what I've got the PhD funding for. I've got it for people studying how technology can help people learn. And that is clearly a very crucial moment. But can you see, I was in a computer science department and I didn't have a plan to go and study this, and everything kind of changed from that point. So I did this project, which I don't talk about very much. So another thing is, I know quite a few of your PhD researchers. I did a PhD, and because of the funding, it was kind of constrained down a particular route. And the long and short of it is, although it will be mentioned on one subsequent slide, my work that I do now has very little, if anything, to do with my PhD work. Many people would not even know what my PhD was about at all. It wouldn't be something I mention very often. And so I say this because people who are doing PhDs or who are in an early career seem to think that whatever they decide to do at this moment in their life is going to shape them forever. And I just don't think that's true. It might shape you forever if you wanted it to. You know, if you can choose something that could shape you forever, then go for it. But if it doesn't work out for you, that's not necessarily the end of the story. And in my case, it was partly to do with funding. And I ended up doing a project that in the end, I didn't really believe in. And that dovetailed with a number of other issues. I don't mind to say, I know this is a large audience. I know I'm being recorded, but I don't mind to say I am one of those many academics who has had a decades-long struggle against medical depression. And during my PhD, I was one of the many PhD students who suffered very, very badly from depression. So if you think about this period where I'm doing a project where I don't really believe in it and I'm suffering from depression, it was a very bad period. And in the end, I clawed my way to the end of the PhD just because I wanted it done. And then I said, I have had enough of universities, and I left. And it took me a few years to come back, only 2 or 3 years. I mean, it's not a huge amount of time, but I took a rest and I had a slightly different career as a consultant for a little while. What I learned from that is, in a sense, you've got to do work that you are personally interested in. If you're not doing work that you're personally interested in, it's very difficult to see why the effort is justified, other than I didn't want to embarrass my family by not completing it or something like that. And that is something that I talk to people about, where they can see different avenues for doing a project, including a PhD project. And it's obvious that one avenue or another will be a lot more effort than some alternative they could imagine. And I wonder whether effort is really the unit that you want to focus on. I wonder whether you really want to do something you believe in, even if that will mean getting up a few hours earlier, a few mornings or whatever, and really believe in it and enjoy it. And I've done research projects since my PhD where I've really had that privilege, and it's really, really fulfilling, and I love it. I didn't have that for my PhD, and I learned the hard way about that issue. So that was a kind of brief history of how I ended up in the TEL field, except it ends with me leaving university. And then in the end, I came back basically a learning technologist working for a university. So that's a second part that more people know. I'm involved in this thing with a group of people from ALT at the moment. I think I saw a name here who's part of that too, where I have, admitted to my sins that I used to be a learning technologist for several years. So I came back into university at one point as a learning technologist, and then it transpired I had a PhD, and I got invited to do some research project that was funded, and then found that they was really, really short-staffed on. And I gradually hooked my way into doing more and more research until such time as my career was ready for a real research transition. I should say also that's not easy. You end up on plenty of fixed-term contracts, or at least I did, 1-year contract, 2-year contract, whatever. And I think we need to talk a lot more in the field about the fact that the funding structures of learning technology and TEL kind of work, unlike the funding structures of much more established disciplines like, I don't know, biological lab science or something, the funding structures are much more unreliable, and it leads people into very, very difficult career choices, career balancing, kind of little bits of portfolio careers or even gig work or whatever. And I think that's something we also don't talk about enough. And where I'd end this part before asking for some questions is ultimately I came to Lancaster, and the reason I came to Lancaster was for the first time ever I was being offered a fully permanent job, not necessarily better or on better money or whatever, but permanent as opposed to 3-year contract, 2-year contract, whatever. So, and I'm going to talk a bit after the next questions about how I've refined my research focus, and a lot of that has kind of happened since coming to Lancaster. But I think it's worth saying that a lot of TEL researchers are real people, is what I was nearly going to say, which is kind of hilarious, right? Well, okay, most of them are real people. I've met a few who I thought might be secretly robots, but they're real people who've come at this from real struggles with real serendipity, and in many cases ended up in this field accidentally, and that's certainly me. So maybe that's a point to open up for questions if anyone has any at this early stage. You're all real, that much I can see. Or either that, I mean, actually, this is the very essence of the Turing test, right? All these people on text claiming they're real, and I'm supposed to interrogate them to find out whether that's true or not.
Vicky's been the first one to tell us that she's not real, so that's okay.
Shall I move on to the next section, since we're all in a moment of stunned silence? So I want to talk about research focus. And if you bear in mind what I've said before, you might guess that this hasn't also had a particularly organised trajectory, at least in the opening stages. We're often told that we should be the go-to person known for something. And that's tricky. But how do you divide up? How do you divide up your own interests? How do you decide you're not interested in something? How do you decide whether that's really a TEL topic? That's often something that gets talked about. How does this work? And there is a very, very cliche way of doing this. And I'd say that this works, but it's just, I want to make clear, not the only way. And the cliched way is to say that you want to become the expert in a certain kind of technology. So I'm trying to pick a technology who at the moment I don't know somebody who specializes in that, so it doesn't seem like a backhanded insult. Interactive whiteboards. Okay, I don't know anybody who's researching that at the moment, or I used to, but you could say I'm going to become the expert on how people use interactive whiteboards. And then it's quite clear what you're not interested in. Does this involve the use of interactive whiteboards or not? It's a fairly Boolean kind of question, right? That you can think of your research in that way. And I know people who do that. And the first thing is, it does actually work. And the other thing is, funders kind of sometimes like it. And it's very good to be able to say, I am the global expert on the use of technology X. To be honest, interactive whiteboards might be seen as slightly old hat now to be the world expert in, but of course, there's always a replacement hoving into view over the horizon. I suppose that is the downside of that approach, is as the technology itself starts to lose its, metaphorical shine, you have to find a replacement and then find a way to link your current research into the new one and find bridges. And I've kind of struggled with these kind of problems a while, because in the end, like several other people, and I think I watched the previous entry in this series by Don, and I think one of the things he raised is where I've sometimes been, is I'm kind of interested in everything. I'm kind of curiosity driven. So how do you figure out some sort of focus? And I've gone through these kind of stages, I suppose. this was my first ever research interest, which should tell you this is to do with my PhD, right? I never even knew what research was before then, because I thought of university in a different kind of way. And really, embarrassing as it might seem now, although I started this 20 years ago, I believe I started my PhD in 2002 and finished it in 2006. So that's kind of the era. I was an extremely young PhD student. I can't claim I'm an extremely young academic anymore, obviously, but I started my PhD, luckily, straight out of undergrad. So I was 21 when I started my PhD. And the way I thought of it was in terms of automation. So the underlying narrative was, well, there's a load of things that we need to do in learning processes that you kind of used to need teachers for. And if we could get a computer to do that, wouldn't that be great? And the reasons are, well, there's increasingly more and more students, and there's not proportionally more teachers. You know, it's a student-staff ratios kind of argument. So if we can get computers to take some of this workload, then that would be fantastic. And the bit I picked was formative assessment. And I said, if we can get students who are actually, in this case, computer science undergraduate students, to submit some solutions to some sort of coursework, and then the student can give them feedback on it, that would take that out of the realm of the teacher having to do it. And furthermore, they could actually have more chances to try that coursework. So you could actually have students submitting the same coursework 9 times or something and getting an increasingly better mark. Okay, so that was where I was, and they were all kind of humans were being, oops, that's not the pen. Humans were going to be supplanted in this kind of model. It was going to be much better on the ratios. And I could have a pedagogical rationale was, you know, this allows students to spend more time on task, to get actual feedback. There was quite a lot of you know, angst about things like that. So that was where I started. And ironically, if I was to look at what happened in my PhD work through the kind of lens I'd use now, a lot of the things I was actually doing, when I look back, were not at all bad. This system was so resource heavy and network heavy and various things, it couldn't be distributed over the internet at that time. And so it was distributed from a local server to a local terminal room, which was huge. You could fit, I don't know, there was probably 80 terminals in this, you know, very, very large open plan aircraft hangar. And we used to get students coming in there doing all this coursework to learn how to program for, you know, half days at a time. And we used to get tutors who were PhD students like me, and I was involved in making part of this system for my PhD, and also getting paid for delivering it as a teaching assistant. PhD students used to hang around in this room teaching students how to program, and then they would submit it to this system which would tell them how good they were. And ironically, that room became quite a community hub. And if I was to analyze it differently now, that was actually quite a nice way for students to learn to program. But I just wasn't really focused on any of that for my research. I was focused on what happens to the student marks as they kind of repeatedly submit. And it really did seem that some students would submit, you know, 7 or 9 times was not rare. And you would get this kind of graph where they would improve marks a lot, and then it would kind of plateau off, and then they'd stop submitting. And did students find the feedback helpful? Well, they said so in a questionnaire, right? So, you know, that was, I designed this system, and we got that kind of data as feedback. And Bob's your uncle or whatever, I was awarded a certificate. I told you already the end point of that. I wasn't sufficiently interested to carry on, and I was struggling a lot in the background at that point. So that didn't in the end go anywhere. But that was where I started, and that would have been my first research agenda. So computers were seen as a novel technology that might actually supplant people. They weren't seen as mediators of society or mediators between interpersonal interaction or anything. They were seen as actually an automating agent. So the next part was when I came in as a learning technologist and gradually started to do more research. We had a period in the kind of, the 2008 financial crash hurt some of this stuff a bit, but we had a period of good investment in learning technology in the UK. And I was involved in this heavily funded initiative, of which there was, I don't know if it now, it's a long time ago, there are either 74 or 79 of these initiatives called Centres for Excellence in Teaching and Learning, funded across the UK with really, I think more than £1 billion was spent on this, or at least an enormous amount of money. I wouldn't be quoted on an exact figure. And a really enormous amount of money was spent. And the centre I was attached to was really focused on visual technologies. And so I ended up moving into this notion that I'm going to focus on all of these different technologies, a little bit like the argument I was talking about a minute ago. I could focus on this technology or that technology or the other technology. And let's see if I can draw on the screen without it advancing the animation. There were these kind of 4: video conferencing, interactive whiteboards, visualizers, which kind of send it's a bit like a webcam, but it's more fancy, and some of them are ceiling mounted and have enormous resolution, or multi-display systems, kind of things that actually have many, many screens. You can make them wall-sized, things like that. You can notice a lot of them are classroom technologies. I'm not particular. I mean, they were mainly connected to the web even at that point, but that wasn't the wow factor of them. The wow factor was often something they did in the room. And I became disheartened because as a computer scientist, I was fascinated by all these technologies and how amazingly great some of them appeared to be. They were certainly very expensive. And then one of two things would happen. Some of them failed immediately, or some of them kind of seemed like they might go somewhere, and some people really liked them, and I got really excited about it. And then either they didn't get the same results in different settings. They might do really well in one course and not another, or in one important instance, which was a multi-display system, did really well in one room it was installed in, and then in another place was absolutely like the kiss of death, seemed to have been attached to it. So it didn't go how I expected, let's put it that way. Either success was hard won, or it wasn't won at all, or it couldn't be generalized. Does anybody here recognize that story? Right? If you've ever been enthusiastic about educational technology, it leads to quite crushing demoralization at certain points, right? So I ended up saying, well, I'm focusing on real use with real students, and I'm going to start publishing papers with, an actual follow this thing, how a load of architecture students use this system over a period of time or whatever, right? Which is an early paper I did once I got to this phase of my career. And I'm going to celebrate failure, and I'm going to say, I'm not a technology evangelist. I'm someone who is researching real use, even if that is failure. And that was, I suppose, a kind of next stage on for me, was to become what somebody like Neil Selwyn would call a kind of pessimist almost, and being kind of happy with that. And that was the first time, ironically, that I felt I needed a theoretical framework to explain this. And I did actually at that point get recommended to me a book, which this book, but if any of you have ever come across it, called Acting with Technology by Kaplan and Nardi, is the book which converted me into becoming an activity theorist. I didn't read anything by Engström for at least a couple of years after that. So that book really changed my views on things, although I found it very, as a computer scientist who hadn't used a theoretical framework before ever at all, I found it very difficult to go into what by any standards is one of the more complicated theoretical frameworks. You know, it was like trying to go from 0 to 100 miles an hour with no intermediate steps. It was quite a tricky moment. But I felt I needed theories to explain this kind of thing. And that is why I came into theory as someone who felt I desperately needed one, because I couldn't explain what I was seeing. Not as someone who'd had a PhD education where everybody told me theory was essential, because that just wasn't the case in my PhD. Now, I told you I started to get interested in why does it work in one place rather than another. And I realized I could have conceived this in different ways. I could have said, well, it works in one discipline differently than another, because actually with some of these multi-display systems, it did work differently for history students than architecture students than whatever other students. But that's not the avenue I chose. I chose to look at the fact that it was the wow factor associated with the room that seemed to make a lot of the difference. And that if I put a certain kind of technology in a certain kind of seminar room, that really seemed to work. Put the same technology somewhere else, it really didn't. In this particular case where it didn't work was a huge open plan library setting. It was a disaster zone that I was, kind of vaguely embarrassed to be associated with, and it was the same piece of kit. The particular piece of kit I'm talking about, if you ever look it up, it's well gone now, but it's called Polyvision Thunder, and it was inordinately expensive, really very expensive, much more than you would ever justify if you didn't have some external money to kind of trigger it. It was, for every one installation was something like £60,000. I mean, it was just, and that was just, you wouldn't put that in every seminar room, would you? But it was a great piece of technology that didn't work well in all these places. So it was kind of odd. So I started to focus on the space, and I started to say, well, university space is a very strange thing. We've got all these absolutely rubbish old seminar rooms, and we've got these flagship rooms, and we've got these kind of huge lecture theatres with all this expense being spent at the same time as some other people are saying lecturing is dead. And, university space is a really, really interesting thing. I still think that, by the way. I probably think of university space in a different way now. But to begin with, I thought of it as rooms. And they were containers for technology. So I was still thinking very technology-oriented thoughts. And I started to think about rooms as containers. And at this point, serendipitously, I got invited to join a funded research project, which was about how universities evaluate space. So in the lead up to 2008, universities were spending an enormous amount on university campuses and flagship installations. And then after 2008, that tailed off for a while. The media and the discourse around this would have you believe, and I think it's true in many cases, that universities are now ratcheting up that investment again, because it's often seen as a way of doing student recruitment. And you'll get this entire rhetoric, which, I kind of agree with. Well, if they can't afford to pay for this and this and this and this other priorities, why can they afford to spend all this on campuses? So certainly at that point, there was a lot of money being spent on designing and implementing spaces, and very little seemed to be happening about their evaluation. So I went from seeing space as something that interacted with technology, when I found activity theory in the early stages a bit difficult to use. I had a brief sojourn into ubiquitous computing, which is a rather easier theoretical framework, which basically has two bits. Technology is a layer of information, and technology oscillates from the periphery to the center of our attention and back again. So I got involved in this project to evaluate how universities evaluate their spaces. So I was evaluating evaluations, if that makes sense as a sentence. was evaluating evaluation programs. And what I went into it, enormously naive, of course, but I went into it thinking, this is an enormously important thing. I mean, the amount of capital outlay on these things is gigantic, and it's supposed to have a lot of impact on learning. So there's going to be a lot of research. How are we going to calculate, how are we going to measure or calculate or whatever, depressing kind of metaphor I was thinking using at that point? How are we going to do any of that? And what I found was another one of many, as you can tell from how this presentation's gone, another crash to the ground, another kind of moment of disappointment. Because I realized that in many cases, the evaluations don't happen. Nobody has any idea whether this makes any difference or not. When they do happen, they are absolutely disappointing. And if I had any idea that this was all about learning, and learning was at that point by me seen in kind of learning science kind of terms, this kind of psychological investigations of learning processes, that kind of thing, that this was not how other people saw learning at all. And evaluations were often about justifying that money hadn't been wasted. And that was roughly it. And I became very, very aware very, very quickly of how political all this was. And people, senior stakeholders who I interviewed as part of this project, would be very open about this because they were being interviewed anonymously. But this stuff, which really was fundamentally central to many students' lives, was being handled in ways that were much more to do with institutional politics and positioning in all sorts of league tables or money or whatever, much more than it was about any semblance of allegiance to pedagogical values or anything like that. And that was another moment where I realized I'd been extraordinarily naive before, and then the scales dropped from my eyes. So yeah, John, I don't normally look at the thing, but your comment flashed into my vision there. It's ubiquitous computing again. Yeah, it turns out in universities, a lot of stuff is like this. So I think where I am at the moment is I'm interested in processes of change. And I'm interested in how processes of change can actually empower people and can actually bring about the kind of values that we actually want, as opposed to having change imposed on us. And I think what you might notice if you look across this trajectory is that technology has taken different positions, and at some points it seems to be much more central than others. And you might see that at this point it seems slightly decentralized. But the fact is that technology is a key site for struggle in all of these kind of change processes. If you look at how technology is increasingly used in universities, and I gave a few examples earlier, almost at the very start of this talk, it seems to be about controlling or policing or making us more efficient or monitoring or whatever. And so actually, technology is absolutely central to these kinds of battles. So this is how my research trajectory has gone. And what I think it shows is to be a TEL researcher doesn't mean focusing on a particular kind of technology. It can be focusing on a particular kind of practice. So you could be a TEL researcher focused on the roles of technology. Informative assessment, for example, would be a perfectly legitimate thing to do. It can involve focusing on issues that seem to butt up against technology, but are not entirely technology themselves, like space. I mean, there is a famous book called Space is the Machine, which of course I latched onto when I was worried I was losing my identity as a TEL researcher. But, you know, space and technology are closely related, but they're not quite the same thing. It can involve researching research or evaluating evaluation. You can become involved in the processes of getting knowledge about these things. My case at the moment involves wider processes in which, despite technology not being in the title, you couldn't get away from technology even if you tried. So it is about technology, even though what I don't say is, you know, I'm only interested in technology in change processes. I'm interested in change processes. But actually, one thing that I think we ought to acknowledge here is that this is not stable. And what seems to happen, which I suppose shouldn't surprise us, but I don't see people talk about enough, is that a lot of this happens because a previous interest we had proved unsatisfying to us in a crucial way. And so we go through a moment of crisis as a researcher, and we seek to replace it at the center of our research identity. And for me, that's roughly what has happened. I, of course, haven't talked about this before, and if I think about it more, maybe it went through more than 5 steps. But even over the course of just thinking about this, I could think of a number of different places I've been over the past years, and it's transformed a lot. And every one of these was a moment where I thought, I don't want to do that anymore, and now I'm going to do this other thing. And they were genuinely very personal moments of crisis or whatever. So now is the next moment where I see and secretly hope if anyone has any questions.
I have a question, I think. So earlier in this slide, you said about technologies that you tried that kind of then died. Was there a particular technology that you tried that you thought was particularly amazing and then it just went the wayside?
I mean, the one I would say is actually the one I briefly mentioned earlier, which was this thing called Polyvision Thunder. There is even a video, a very old video of me on YouTube demonstrating this to some students. And compared with PowerPoint presentations, it seemed to offer a way for students to really construct knowledge and engage with knowledge on the fly. So I was very interested in how students might use this in presentations. And I really thought it was doing a very good job. It connected to the web. So if you weren't present locally, you could even go to the presentation using a kind of web interface. I know that that's not particularly novel now in the era of Zoom and how we're doing this presentation, but it was actually quite novel then. Even most interactive whiteboards wouldn't do that. But really, it provided such a free-form way of bringing resources, annotating stuff, reorganizing things. So you could have, say, 8 slides being shown across this wall, and you could literally, you had a panel that was, it was actually a plasma television, usually hung in a portrait kind of way with a pen, and that was what you were using to control the rest of the wall. So it was like having a big, you know, like my TV, but with an LED over the front of it. And why didn't that work? Well, one thing is it actually wasn't very good at interfacing with a lot of other standard technologies. So that to get PowerPoint slides into that thing was an enormous labor, which people didn't always want to do. It wasn't considered very secure. So the whole reason, the use case that the company had in mind for it was that anybody in a corporate setting would just walk up to it like any flip chart and just start writing. Whereas in a university setting, given this thing was connected to the internet, it had to be secured, so it didn't provide unsecure access to the Janet network and things legally. And so you had to start putting login screens on the front, which it didn't have a keyboard to kind of manage. And so it just didn't fit its ecosystem very well. And also, it was very difficult to imagine how your presentation was going to look before you got there, because you didn't have another technology like that to kind of prepare it on. You know, you were preparing at home in something that didn't have 8 screens across a wall, and then you get there and go, oh, if I knew it was going to look like that across there, that looks amazing, but actually I've made some mistakes. You know, so it was a brilliant idea that kind of didn't fit its ecosystem in all kinds of ways that seemed individually like they shouldn't kill it. And then it was like a death by 1,000 cuts. They absolutely did kill it. You know, so yeah, Polyvision Thunder was a lovely piece of technology. Somebody had really thought about it very carefully in some ways. You know, so yeah.
I think Regina also has a question.
Yes, if I may. Brett, thank you very much. This looks like a very, how can I say, very interesting journey here. I'm really interested in the two last steps here, where if I look at your topics like disabused learning is an apolitical act within institutions, and then the role also of technology as a vehicle for emancipation or control on the other side. Where do you see this heading in terms of the trend that we have? And I'll give you a bit of background on my question. One of the reasons why I've moved away from the TEL space to a certain extent is that at my institution at the moment, technology enhanced learning or e-learning generally is very much along the lines of self-paced learning, as little touch as possible, as much efficiency as possible. You know, we have banks of FAQs instead of teachers. So is that something that you're worried about? Is that something that you see as a trend, or have you got hope? And I hope you say yes to my second part of the question, that this, you know, the emancipatory role of technology is something that will in the end prevail, or maybe it's a combination of both.
Well, I won't say, oh no, I have absolutely no hope. Let's all give up now. But it isn't unqualified hope. I mean, that kind of idea, the self-regulated image that you've portrayed, is a very persistent one. I mean, when machines, as they were called, were first brought into the education sphere, people like B.F. Skinner, a kind of well-known American behaviorist, had books called things like Teaching Machines, where the idea was exactly what you said. Somebody would go and sit. And actually, I think even earlier than that, there was, I now remember I read a long time ago Aldous Huxley's Brave New World novel, in which it was exactly about exposing people to a certain amount of repetitions on a machine. And the one explanation for why the kind of some of the people in the novel were slightly weaker than others was that had kind of broken down. They hadn't had enough repetitions. So this is a very, very, very persistent idea. And that is actually a political act in itself. When you said, I'm interested in you saying this is a political act, that is a political act. It's a way of saying, we want learning to be precisely controlled. We want it to be about something that's kind of purely content knowledge based. We certainly want people being drilled in with a load of engineering knowledge and not talking to other people where they might come across problematic ideas. You know, it's very, very political. And it's political in a small piece sense as well, because it's all about cheapness and efficiency and return on investment and things like that. So that is everywhere. I think we have to struggle against it. And I do see some optimism in the sense purely that increasingly technology's value is often seen throughout wider society in being about mediating between people. So technology brings people together across networks would be a very, very popular, not very radical way of looking at technology at the moment. That already does get us away a little bit from your kind of entirely self-regulated learning kind of idea. That's a double-edged sword. If you go back a long time to the birth of the internet, I think Camille talked about this in her talk in this series. If you go back to the birth of the internet, was all about how this was going to be absolutely brilliant and create a brand new, amazing society. Nowadays, we know, don't we, that bringing people together via networks can have some quite dark sides to it, right? I'm influenced by this book called Kill All Normies by Angela Nagel, which is entirely about, you know, it has examples like the rise of far-right politics on the internet and so on and so on. So in this case, though, technology is worth struggling over. It's something that I think can be a vehicle for good and bad. And the issue is we have to be prepared to struggle to make sure that it's the good or the bad. It's not something where I think you have to wait and see whether it's more good than bad. It's something you have to get involved in the struggle over. And that for me is part of the emancipation vision. I'll say more about that at the end of the presentation, because I want to talk about kind of what I mean by that and offer a research methodology, although I think in your case, you might know what that methodology is. But it's about saying, you know, one way of having the future is to build it yourself, you know, don't just sit there and wait to see what happens. And that's kind of partly what I mean by emancipation and change. So if that answers it a little bit.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, let's see how I get through the next bit. I notice I'm drifting on time, which is always a danger with me, even when I'm doing something that I know more about. When I say I know more about, I know a fair amount about this. It's all about me, right? But it's not something I talk about enough. Anyway, let's see if I can get through the next phase quickly, especially since, and ironically, since the next phase has quite a bit of content to it. So that's a good one to be trying to rattle through. And I'm going to bring in my theoretical influences. Now, let me say something about what I'm not going to talk about. And what I'm not going to talk about is how do you turn theoretical influences into a theoretical framework? And I'm not going to talk about that because I think many of you will have heard me talk about that before, if I look down the list of names. And also, if you haven't, there's a YouTube video of me literally waffling on that, riffing on that topic for 2 hours. So I do not propose to be doing that today. Okay, how exactly to use all this stuff in research? There will be an example at the end in the 4th section, but I'm not going to go through that as a process. I'm going to talk about my own theoretical influences, and I decided to go for the throat with this and just talk about my real theoretical influences as opposed to ones that, you know, are polite dinner conversation. And the feminists and the basically they're all white men. So anybody who is going to start doing those kind of counting games is going to have me, because every single name here is a white man, and I'm absolutely aware of it. And that's why I thought, well, am I going to try and, I mean, I nearly had, I nearly had Rosa Luxemburg, who I do like a lot. That would have certainly been a woman. And I could have had W.E.B. Du Bois as well. That's a kind of not white person and so on. But I'm just going to go for the ones I typically think of, and they're all white males. And I know it, and I know I'm going to be damned for it. But what can I do? It's probably not the worst thing I would be damned for. It's probably the second one that's going to get me in the current political climate. But anyway, so it won't surprise anyone who's known me for more than 5 minutes that Marx and Engels are very important to me. If you look on my Twitter profile, I realize the first thing it says almost after my name is Marxist. The term Marxist being coined by Engels, who was the first Marxist, really. So this is a team. They worked together. I don't particularly plan to get involved in separating them. So this is Karl Marx here, and this is Fred Engels here. These are, well, the two people here and here are Karl Marx's daughters, who became, after Karl Marx's death, absolute firebrands in their own right. So this was, unfortunately, the little boy did not survive to adulthood. So what I get from Marx and Engels are some quite seemingly sensible points, but if you take them to their logical conclusions, they challenge a lot of our thinking. So the first thing is that it's the material world that governs our social consciousness. We don't just kind of have ideas. We have to get up in the morning. We have to be able to survive. We have to be able to live and eat and be social beings and a lot of other needs. And in order to do that, we have to live from day to day, week to week, month to month, etc. We also, of course, have to be able to survive from generation to generation. And in going through all of the things we have to do to get there and not kind of die, there's a lot of routine, there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of stuff. And if you look at the rhythms of all of that and how that's changed over vast historical periods, you see that people think differently depending on when they live and what kind of period it was and their position in the social structure of when they lived. So it's how we live that governs our social consciousness. It's not the fact that this person had a kind of particularly good idea one day. Okay. And so I tend to see ideas as a secondary thing. And in academia, which is often all about the latest idea or even the latest slightly rebadged idea, that's not always a fashionable thing to say. The next thing is real knowledge of the world. This is actually emblazoned on Karl Marx's tombstone. This was one of his more famous phrases. But we gain knowledge of the world by trying to change it. Marx had this very strong notion that if you just sit there in a chair stroking your beard, which is a lot of fun, by the way, if you happen to have a beard, and if not, I might suggest you get either a real one or a fake one. But if you, exactly, Tom, you can't beat it, right? But if you do just do that and you sit there in your chair stroking your beard and thinking, you can often, you know, realize a few things, but there's a lot of things in the world that will remain hidden to you. You won't notice stuff until you change it. And so it's on Marx's tombstone. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Okay, it's that kind of very strong epistemological commitment. And actually, I picked this book up, so I'll use it now. Rosa Luxemburg carried on that thinking by saying, people who don't move never notice their chains. Okay, so that's another a variation on the same kind of thought. So it's by engaging with the world and trying to change it that we figure out the structures of the material world that have been governing our social consciousness before. Okay. A very unfashionable view is that it's people who make history, not under circumstances they choose, of course, but it's people who do it. This is a very strong statement of human agency, of course, which is why it's unfashionable, because we're all supposed to be, you know, post-human or whatever. But it's people who actually feel the need to change history and will strive and struggle and whatever. And ultimately, I believe, no matter what complicated vocabulary you can get into with post-humanism, things like toasters do not feel that sense of inner struggle that I might do. So that is why humans drive history, is that they experience the world and then feel the need to change it. Marx had a strong notion, and Engels too, on naming the agents of change. And so in his era, the agents were the working class, who he had to then define very carefully. And it's not actually the common definition of working class we use now, but he actually named who is actually going to carry out some change. And I often take that point, and it's going to come up again later. Who is being put in charge by this change? Who is running it? Who is setting its goals? This is really quite important. And both Marx and Engels, contrary to what you might have read elsewhere, actually did believe in a human nature. They called it species being, but anyway, it's the nature of what it means to be human. And ultimately, their suggestion, which is contrary to our usual discussions, is that the contemporary world of competition and whatever, you know, which is often derived from, okay, it's capitalist and it's something to do with survival of the fittest, something evolution, therefore this world fits our human nature, right? You must have all heard arguments like this. For Marx, that's not true. Human nature is cooperative. Human nature is about creating things and having them valued. Human nature is about trying to, he talks about how you sit between another individual and the rest of the species, trying to mediate and help someone on behalf of the rest of the species, whatever. So for him, human beings are innately social and sociable. And for him and Engels, the current world is not that. What we actually want is to struggle for something that is more human. which is something that does inspire me to this day, despite the fact it does seem inordinately difficult to achieve. The next one, I told you the second one might be the most controversial. It shouldn't be that surprising after I've shown you those as the first one, but the next one is Lenin. Okay, so not altogether popular to be choosing Russian people in your slides at the moment, I understand. But Lenin, of course, is typically being cursed by Putin at the moment as the creator of Ukraine, for which Lenin probably actually did do. If in case it bothers you to have a Russian on the slide at the moment, you should know that one of Lenin's slogans in the last couple of years of his life was, and I quote, "War to the death on great Russian chauvinism." So not the kind of thing you would normally hear Putin say. So Lenin, what I take from him is we need to base our lives or our practices on open, honest, robust debate that, if necessary, goes on for really extended periods of time. Lenin was known for engaging in absolutely voluminous amounts of debate with people that he disagreed with. And to be honest, by modern standards, for being a bit rude in it as well. He wasn't a particularly diplomatic kind of guy. If you read his works, he's incredibly blunt. But we kind of need that. It kind of steels people and it allows people to reach common positions. The other thing that Lenin did was to form organizations and to really develop them over extended periods of time. And I believe that a lot of TEL research is carried out on an incredibly individualistic basis, which ironically in many other technology fields is not a temptation at all. There are very few computer scientists who carry out their work as lone scholars. So somehow a lot of technology enhanced learning research has got a very humanities model of working. And I think what we need is organizations. We need those organizations to have their own ways of speaking and putting things out there. And I've tried in various ways, for example, by poking and prodding with the Center for Technology Enhanced Learning, by having an open access journal, to have these organs. I'm going to talk, if I get a chance, about another thing I'm doing at the end of this talk. But basically, we try to form collectives that are based on open extended debate and firm principles. And then a variety of other things. So the first thing is, and these are slightly contradictory, but that's what they're supposed to be. You take action based on principles, but you're willing to compromise. And I am actually, I'm serious about this. This is my bedtime reading at the moment, okay? So I'm really reading Lenin in the 20 minutes before I go to sleep. One of the things he talks about a lot is that when they had a revolution in Russia, there was all these other people all over the world who also wanted a revolution. And they were writing stuff in which they said, we want to have a revolution just like they did in Russia, and we're going to have no compromises. And he's going, you do realize that our entire history of the last 20 years is just littered with about 1 million compromises. Let me show you a few examples. It goes on for 20 pages. You know, it's kind of like that, right? But the point was, there were reasons, and they didn't pretend. They didn't say, oh, we've secretly done a victory here, and this is what we wanted to do all along. No, they really said, we didn't really like this, but we did it for reasons. So being firm about what your principles are and where you're prepared to compromise and why, and what you're not prepared to compromise on. And I think for me, the issue is for a lot of people, and it has been me in the past, that I was quite prone to having a tantrum if something wasn't going my way and flouncing out of a project or whatever. And in the end, research is about self-gratification. I've talked about that earlier, but it should be about more than that. It should be about trying to achieve something in the medium to long term. And sometimes that means sitting there and grinning and bearing it. And when I am grinning and bearing something, it's often Lenin I think of, and I go, he wouldn't have allowed himself that flounce. That flounce out and screaming your own principles would have made you feel good for the afternoon, but would have destroyed something afterwards. And he would have absolutely told me off for being self-indulgent or something like that, right? So This is what I get from Lenin. Then we go to Vygotsky. And I think we take something really important from Vygotsky, which is a lot of people in education more broadly, and in TEL for sure, have very, very broad ideological commitments. There is even this this rhetoric happens sometimes in the British media, and I'm sure it happens in other countries of the world, that talks about how all education academics are pretty much Marxists. I wish that were true. I mean, I haven't hidden that I am, but I wish that were true. It absolutely isn't. But they have broader commitments. They kind of, want to say something bigger about the world, and then they're kind of frustrated at the fact that their own little project is something much smaller than that. And actually, they're trying to make it relevant to their broader commitments, and you often feel it's being sledgehammered in. Vygotsky was a genius for perhaps one main thing, which is to genuinely realize how some very, very big concepts, like the ones coming from Marx, Engels, and Lenin, would actually have an implication at an interpersonal level, and really have an implication at an interpersonal level. So he was able to take the kind of things that Marx had said about society and say, well, at the psychological level, we won't use the same words or the same concepts, but I'm absolutely going to see how that drills down. And then I'm going to come up with a way of investigating that genuinely, as opposed to just saying something very, very mechanical. So he kept really true to the principled side of things, but he was creative, and he recognized that the number of mediations between society and the psyche is quite a lot, and really tried to do something creative to investigate it. And I think that's a really important thing, that if you're somebody like me who has broad, things that I'm calling world historical kind of commitments, and then what you're actually doing is a project about, I don't know, like interactive whiteboards, there's quite a lot of remove there, right? That's not a very obvious bit of applicability. And you can do that really wrongly. And you can kind of make things really mechanical, and you can make things not fit at all. And it feels like what I said a minute ago, the sledgehammer. So Vygotsky was a genius at figuring out how that really works in a way that I have to say most sociologists say, in my experience of reading their stuff, are not. The other thing he did was to focus on development and change, and to develop methodologies to investigate and promote that change. And those seriously inspire my work. And if I get a chance, they'll come up in a moment. So the kind of thing I do is inspired by Vygotsky's kind of developmental research, as it was called, which involved understanding how people can be empowered to change. The next one is Engström, who will seem closer to the where many of you are, because he's an educational researcher. Just imagine that, an actual educational researcher in this talk. Engström's not a particularly conventional educational researcher, it has to be said. For example, he, like me, is a bit skeptical about what's going on in a lot of actual educational institutions. And Engström's work is often much more about, helping homeless people on the streets of some city or something, than it is about figuring out how to make science lectures slightly more exciting or whatever. So Engström has taken this principle. I have to say Engström didn't invent the first one, but he certainly popularized it in the West. The thing we need to focus on is the activities. And this is you can see this running through. The material world governs social consciousness has now become, it's the activities we undertake in the real world that from which we learn. Okay, and actually there's a really, really strong, if you were to map it in much more detail than I have, there's a really, really strong kind of theoretical thread through all of this. But the core point is about agency again. Once again, there's a thread from down here. Learning should not be about internalizing stuff that other people have already said. it's not about memorizing facts. Now, we're not going to claim it's not at all, or that memorization has nothing to do with learning. But we are going to claim, and Engstrom does claim, that the kinds of learning that are most important in the present world are not really about that. I mean, I remember, you know, a maths teacher in the 1990s telling me I wouldn't always have a calculator in my pocket. How foolish he must feel now. But it's more than that. It's not just about the fact that technology has made memorization less important. It's also about the fact that what we need to be doing is creating constantly new knowledge that doesn't already exist at the point you start the learning process. And that is the kind of learning that Engestrom's involved in. So Engstrom says, okay, learning ideally, and it's a kind of normative argument, it's a should, but learning should be a form of changing of activity, in which people develop new knowledge, they develop new artifacts, they develop new social structures, and in the process, they change themselves. And actually, they boost their own agency, both collectively and as a group. And for Engstrom, that is the ideal for learning. And for that reason, he's a bit negative about schools and universities, because a lot of learning in schools and universities is, you know, it isn't like that, is it? You will know it's not like that, don't you? Right? It's kind of like that. And once again, Engstrom focuses on process. I think this is an important point, by the way, process. How technology is used throughout a process, let's just cut to a particular implication. How technology is used throughout a process going to be different at different times. If you understand that things have stages, that things get broken down, that activities have different moments, they last for long periods of time, they get broken down into chunks, you might understand that saying, well, what role does activity play in activity X is a slightly odd question, because, well, when? You need to start tracing how this changes and develops over time. And like Vygotsky, Engstrom is into methodology development. Okay, and that is pretty much that chain from developmental research to developmental work research to the change laboratory that I would mention at the end. Obviously, briefly, he glances at the clock. And then the final one is Andy Blunden, who's another activity theorist. Wouldn't call him an educational researcher, but is another activity theorist for sure, who's drawn a lot of attention to the central role of institutions in social life, and says actually institutions are almost fossilized social movements, and we can view social movements as a form of activity. And the interesting thing there is that one way in which you can change institutions is by opening them to an immanent critique. What you say there is, well, this is what you claim this institution is about. Now, why aren't you really doing it? That's a kind of immanent critique. It's to hold somebody true to their own stated position. And in higher education, I find that particularly powerful. But once again, such processes will develop new knowledge. And Blunden is particularly explicit. I mean, Engstrom has this entire bundle of things. Blunden is particularly explicit about the notion of concepts and what concepts are. And it's made me particularly interested in what concepts are developed when people try to change their own world. I'll talk about methodology. Let's see if I can do this in the 6 minutes available. As everyone will know, he says, smirking, as many of you will know, activity theory is associated with this kind of triangular model. So activity is often portrayed as this triangular diagram. I don't think that's Engestrom's most valuable contribution. I think it's the stuff I actually talked about on the previous slide that's the most valuable contribution. But in essence, what I want to talk about here is how people can change. And in order to change, what they really have to do is design their own activities. So that's kind of the purpose of this slide, is this person is actually designing their own little micro world and seeing if it can be inhabited. Okay. So, yeah, John, there had to be a triangle in here somewhere, but it's probably not the one you expected. I have been involved in a number of projects with a number of methodologies attached to them. And I don't say that there's only one way to do research. I have been particularly at an earlier stage when I was looking at how technologies were used in spaces. If you remember that diagram, like the middle one, I was particularly interested in that there in ethnography. I really wanted to go into rooms. In my case, I used to use video cameras and record people doing stuff and also take notes and whatever. And I still think that's a very, very good way of doing research that I wish people did more of. I, of course, do case studies based on interviews. That's a time-honored method, but you didn't come to this talk to hear me talk about that because it's like meat and potatoes of the research world, right? The other thing I do very much value is the critical literature review. I think we do in the technology enhanced learning area fetishize the notion that if we only gather a small amount of data, we're probably doing real research. Whereas if we do a literature review, that's somehow being lazy. And I hear that such a lot. And I ask myself, have you ever done a real literature review? Because that's quite a hard thing. So I value all of those. But given the time remaining, I want to talk about a particular methodology that means something to me and just say something about a kind of approach to research that I wish was done more. So I'm interested increasingly in what I'll call potentiality. And I want to define that for the sake of brevity in a particular way. Let's say that this is the way that things are being done now. Notice that there's a historical component. I always start from the present. I actually probably end up in any project going into the past too. I never imagine that there's a blank slate. And then because I'm interested, like Marx, in change and the notion that we might actually get knowledge by trying to change things, I'm going to try and change it. And I don't lie, I'm going to try and change it because that actually is something I like doing. There's no point disguising that. But it's also a more deep epistemological position. I'm going to try and change something because we might really learn something then about the structures that were previously hidden. And I'm going to try and change it with the people involved. So name your agents. I want these people to come together as a subjectivity. Even in some cases, that's some collective identity that already exists. And if not, I'm hoping in the course of the project, we're going to actually try and create one. And this is what I want to explore. This is kind of the starting point. But what I want to explore is this. And this is very Vygotskian. What is the potentiality for change in this situation? Where could we go? I'm not interested in this, like imagining stuff off the top of my head that's never going to happen. Where could this go? Can we explore what Vygotsky would have called the zone of proximal development for an entire activity or a set of activities? And that is the methodology I'm trying to prioritize in my current work. The broad area is called formative intervention. And what this involves is collecting together a group of people who face similar objects of activity and going through a process of exploring with them how their activity can be changed in order to learn something about its potentiality and in the process learn something about the current status as well, of course. And to do that in a way in which I'm going to be very focused on process because there's a lot of literature about what kind of processes boost the agency of the people involved and actually make change more likely. But I'm not going to be very focused on setting the direction of the change at the beginning because I want that to come from the people. Okay, so this isn't design-based research or something like that where I have an idea and I want to test it. This is all about conceptualization. The real work of the change laboratory is in conceptualization. And so this often in my work is called the change laboratory. The fact is the change laboratory is a specific design for doing this. There are more. In fact, there are several more. So the broad heading is formative intervention. And what this often looks like, I do not want Google Drive at this moment. What this often looks like is people coming together in workshops over a period of time to talk and then going away in between those workshops and doing stuff off their own bat. And more than that, the initial workshops having quite a strongly structured nature, and gradually the participants taking control of the process and pushing out my structure, reacting against it and saying, no, we want to be doing X. And that is my current kind of research agenda, is to research change and development from this point of view of potentiality, which I believe will always have a lot to do with change and development, because technology is everywhere and it's often the kind of thing we're trying to react against. It will also have something to do with technology in the sense that a lot of the activities we're trying to change on now are happening online, but it often can bring together a wider set of stakeholders. So technology is often the topic of discussion, it's core to the activities we're trying to change, and it might actually be a vehicle for running the intervention project. But in essence, I'm not saying I'm interested in the role of technology here. I'm interested in change and development and potentiality, and I have this way of approaching it, which encompasses technology in a wide variety of ways. And given time, I won't say this in any more detail, but briefly, I'm involved in forming a partnership between the university and a load of local stakeholders to do this in a local area. And I'm actually involved in forming a group of people. There's actually 2 of these networks going on, people actually using this methodology, where we're coming together to try and have almost a change laboratory to further develop the change laboratory approach, which was developed for face-to-face workshops, and we want to do more online. So that's my current research agenda, and this is, for me, I hope you can see, very deeply aligned with my personal values, the theoretical values I set up earlier. They all kind of eventually align. I only wish I'd got there sooner, which could be said for this presentation too, I suppose. But anyway, thank you for listening, and I'll hand over to my very capable chairs.
All right, well, thank you very much, Brett. Does anyone have any questions? We can stay a few minutes longer if anyone has questions.
I will ask something. I did allude to it in the chat, just based on your current research interest, Brett. Have you come across speculative design before? And the idea of, I think there's a book called Speculative Everything, and it seems quite aligned to what you're looking at there a little bit. It does go further into the realm of the realm that you're not interested in, but it does look at that kind of design process. Kung Meal know all about it, who's got her hand up, because I did I used it in my autoethnography as my theoretical framework.
So I haven't heard of speculative design itself, but it doesn't surprise me to hear something like that, because I think it's the need of the moment is we need this kind of thinking. I have heard of design thinking. I have heard of speculative fiction. So, I'm already either side of what you've just said. Speculative fiction particularly has a lot of purchase at Lancaster University. There's a lot of people in the Institute of Contemporary Arts here using things like that. I think what it shows is there's a lot of genuine need for research to be something about creativity, rather than either just documenting things that are already happening or kind of testing hypotheses or something, particularly in the social era. I would say that the difference between the change laboratory and formative intervention and a lot of design-based approaches is that design-based approaches do often seem to quickly go to the solution finding element. Like they want to find a novel solution as quickly as they can. And I have to say, when I'm doing the kind of research I'm doing, I'm often, for a while at the beginning, holding people back from that, because I really want them to think, what's the nature of the problem that drives them to need a solution in the first place? How are the various problems they're encountering, which all seem fragmented and different, located in a wider system? What's the previous history of trying to solve this problem? Do we have an idea of what, every landscape is littered with previously failed attempts to solve it, or even previous successful attempts of solving a previous problem that led to the current situation. So a lot of design things, despite what they might say on paper, are less aware than I'd like them to be about, I suppose, the nature of changing activity rather than designing new activity. They're slightly different focuses, but nonetheless, I do sympathize with how the people have got there, and it does interest me perhaps much more than some other forms of research, which I won't name.
I just thought you'd find it interesting. Happy days.
I think Kyung-mi has a question now.
Okay, thanks for the talk. It was interesting. I'm pretty sure that I know most of it. So probably I wanted to hear something at the end, something more, kind of, I know that we're all developing. We're not like done deal here. So I'm pretty sure that Brett, you're also like growing and developing consistently. So I can see how you've been, but I think for me, listening to you actually talking officially about your personal history and the 4 different sections, and I was expecting there should be, or I hope that there should be something that you kind of cut through it. So for example, that you coming from particular cultural background and your, necessary love towards certain theory and your action, I think I can see some kind of thread going. But my question is more than that, in a way that, but what I feel lacking is that there should be something, when you actually say that you kind of like change lab and you don't have any personal agenda, and let the other people who are like all kind of within the very neoliberal higher education context with their own agenda, which may not be aligned with Marxist ideology that you are bringing in. So, I mean, there should be something more, I don't know, activist kind of mindset that you bring in, and very political, and trying to fight against this, crazy society or whatever. And then when you do change lab, it's okay, let them talk. However, is there something more that you fundamentally, you kind of really, I don't know. So it's my question. I don't know. Probably you can have like a couple of minutes to think about, end up you will be someone else than what you're thinking you are right now. Does that make sense?
I mean, it does make sense. It's not the most straightforward question I've ever had posed to me, but I think the issue of the dichotomy between imposing your own personal views and empowering people is an interesting question. It was posed, actually, it's one of the things that Lenin is most controversial about, if you go back in history, and it's something I didn't particularly cover, but Lenin is often accused of saying, socialist consciousness will never just spontaneously arise in the working class by themselves. We have to kind of indoctrinate them with it. And I think I don't really agree with that interpretation of Lenin. I think he sees the fact that socialist intellectuals have always been a part of the working class means that they, when they speak, are perfectly legitimate actors to speak on as part of the class. And I think that's sort of where I am with research, in that in Vygotsky's experiments, it's very much part of the design that the researcher acts as part of the experiment. And within a change laboratory, I do not sit there pretending I do not have views. I don't sit there hiding my Marxism, for example. You know me well enough to know I wouldn't do that very well anyway. But I don't sit there pretending I'm somebody I'm not. I pick people out. Change laboratories are not consensual, happy, cuddly things. They are about debate and understanding how we can change this situation. But I am perfectly willing for people to push back. And in fact, I'm kind of hoping for that to be the case. So I think what we're getting at here is there's not this dichotomy between hiding yourself and empowering the participants, or imposing yourself and over-directing the participants. What there is the need to be a provocateur and to give people something to react against and to trigger their passions and to kind of do it that kind of way. And that is, I think, a strength of the Change Laboratory, where I really can go in and say, I think what's happening at the moment is a nightmare because of capitalism or whatever. I mean, I do sometimes say it in that way, as you know, but for somebody else to equally strongly be able to come back and go, no, I don't agree. And for example, in the current project I'm doing, that's called the Half Hectare Project, that involves forming a partnership, there's a lot in that about developing this garden, which is why it's called the Half Hectare Project, and developing an online platform to support children visiting this garden to engage in sustainable food production. And yet, part of that seems to be developing in such a way that involves thinking about how we could form a business around, helping children to think about how to set up their own businesses as an entrepreneur in a way that, I've got this thing going on where that might be a cooperative business they might be nudged towards. But this is an open argument. It's not something we need to hide. So in essence, I get your point. But I think what you need to do is to be really, really open about your views and be prepared for somebody to disagree. And actually for that process of conflict to be creative, I think that is the solution.
Thank you.
Okay, I think the last question is from Leonard.
Yeah, a bit of a potentially spicy question. You've alluded to, you've talked about your values for research methodologies and types of TEL research. And at one point you mentioned, how often people get excited about TEL research, even with, the smallest kind of data samples, but, shy away from doing, say, a good literature review. And I think at one point you kind of said that there was certain types of research you weren't going to disparage. Could I just invite you to kind of just lay it out? And what is it? What type of TEL research does the world of TEL need the least of? What have we seen enough of?
Okay. I mean, I don't mind to say it. I have to say there is a video on YouTube of me talking about this stuff in more detail, where the other speaker has killed me, who asked the question before you. I've written about some of my reservations about TEL research in a journal editorial. I think a lot of the thing that I really don't like about TEL research, it's where it just seems to be at TEL casts itself as some sort of support industry for various other people who need us to back them up. And that can be directed by, depends. If you're in schools, it's often directed by really, national policymakers or something like that. Or if you're in universities, it's often the management needs a problem answering. How can we get the kids to better engage with technology X? And I think, for me, one of the problems that TEL has is it does too often accept its research questions from outside, rather than saying, the first thing I'm going to do is to ask you, is that problem you think is the problem really the problem? I know that's a slightly odd sentence, in terms of its structure, but is that really the problem? Is that really what we should be investigating? And I think TEL researchers need, at a very fundamental level, to have a strong conversation with them every time they take on a project about what the research questions are and how they're going to address them. Now, you might say, well, I was asking you about, research methods like interviews or something. Well, I know that. But the fact is, if you allow somebody else to dictate your research questions, you've already been boxed into a corner, because the formulation of the research questions often invites you to design the project in a certain way. So I don't like research that thinks it's going to offer direct solutions to policymakers, however that looks, whether that's something that's going to solve a problem in some university or whatever. For me, research should be trying to bridge this gap between both practical knowledge and scholarly knowledge, and contributing and relating the two at the same time. And so it's not that I want to disparage a piece of research that has 20 interviews and nothing else, because I've done work like that. It's not that I want to disparage questionnaires, although, do you know what, if I was being a bit more relaxed, I'd say I often don't like a lot of questionnaire-based research, honestly, but there can be good questionnaire-based research. And in fact, Karl Marx once wrote a questionnaire, so it has to be good, right? But in general, I want research to say the way we understand the problem is in this way, and the reasons for understanding the problem in this way are as follows, and then say, okay, now having stated that, I'm going to devise a research project that addresses the real problem. And a lot of the time, it's at that moment when I read a paper and I just go, almost by the time I read the research questions, I as an experienced reader, in most cases, by the time you read the research questions, you know where everything else is going. And often I read the research question and I just go, and it's that I want TEL research to engage in less, if that makes sense, rather than particular methodologies. Of course, I want to give you the answer. You should all do a change lab, but I couldn't make that fly, I guess. I want half of you to do change labs. That's more achievable, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's the kind of thing I was looking for. Thanks.
All right, well, I think that does it. Thank you so much, Brett, for making the time and joining us today. Thank you, everyone who's joined us.